Here we have the text of the task, and it's time to devise a plan for how to solve it. But before we do that, it is important that we understand what we need to do. So the first step in Polya's problem-solving technique is to understand the problem. And if we read the task, we can see that there is a lot of text for the context of why we need to do it. We are helping our neighbor and so on. But reading it, the thing that I found that tells us what to do is display the multiplication table on the screen. This is what we need to do. So I'm going to mark that and say that this is what we need to do. And there is also some information about how to do it. We shall use nested count control loops, and we have, luckily for us, an output telling us how it should look when it's finished. So we can see that there are 10 rows and 10 columns, which will give us an indication of, in our loops, our for loops, what will the condition be. So that can help us. Something to note is what it says here under note, that it's simplified. There are no headers. There's no column and row headers here. If you look at the next task, that task includes also printing the headers. But for this task, we are only writing the sum for example, 3 times 2. So that would be 6, or 3 times 1 would be 3. So we're only writing the sum here. All right, so that is what we need to do. Now let's devise our plan now that we have made sure that we understand the problem. As usual, I'm going to draw a flowchart here. You could use pseudocode also, that is also a solution, but I'm going to stick with my flowcharts here. So I'm going to start by adding the start and end. Now we know that we have a start of the script and an end of the script. So what do we need to do? Well, it tells us here that we should use nested loops. We should have one loop which is for the number of rows and another nested loop which is for each line, or for what we're going to print on each line. So you could imagine, as in one of the other tasks, we said that the outer loop is for controlling the number of rows and the inner loop is for controlling what's happening on each line, so to say. So we want to have one loop here deciding what to print on each line, the columns on each line, and the outer loop, as we said, that is how many times we're going to print those lines. And I'm going to start adding a few stuff here, and then we can talk about it, but let me add a little bit of boxes here. So here we have the groundworks for our nested loop. So what I have done here is, after we added the start and the end, I said that, all right, for the outer loop, that is going to control the number of rows. So how do we know how many we should have? Well, if we initialize y to be 0, and then we have a loop, a for loop, that continues to run as long as y is less than 10. That's going to give us 10 iterations. It's far from finished here, but if we imagine that this part here is, if it's true, that it's still less than 10, what are we going to do then? Well, then we are going to take care of each line or each row in what we're going to print, and we're going to print 10 things, 10 numbers on each row here. So, alright, what do we need to do then? We need to do the same thing. It's just that we have our inner loop, which is controlling the number of columns, or x. So I say that x starts to be 0, and then we're going to do something 10 times. What are we going to do 10 times? Well, that is what's going to be here when we are adding stuff here. Alright, but maybe I should change this box, because let's think about what we're going to do. I can remove the arrow too. What do we want to do on each iteration in the inner loop? What we want to do is display x times y, or y times x. So for example, if we pick 5 and 3 as an example, we want to print 15 here. And what is that? That is the column number 5 times the row number 3. So that's what we want to do here. So I'm going to add here to say that, all right, display y times or x times y. That is something we want to do for each iteration in the inner loop, which also turns out that it's going to be each iteration for each row, or for each row here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. What do we want to do after that? Oh, I'll just copy this one instead. What do we want to do after we have displayed one of the numbers? Well, we want to increase x. So if we print 1, then we want to increase it so that we move forward to do 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Do that here. And we need to go back from here to here somewhere. I will clean this up in a little bit, just so that we get an idea of what's going to happen here. But alright, let's imagine that we are on the first row and we have printed 10 values. So we start with x is 0. What do? We display that a value, and then we display the second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. Now we have printed all the 10 values. What is it time to do now? Well, before we start printing the next 10 values, we must change the line. So we must have a new line here before we start with the second row. So let's add that. Alright, so we are now back in the outer loop. In the outer loop we had one loop, but after that loop finishes, we want to print a new line. And after that, we're going to do the same thing as we did with x here. We're going to add 1 to x. Or to y, sorry. And then we go back here. And when we are finished with all the 10 rows, I want it to end. I'm going to clean this up a little bit, and then we're going to take a second look at it. Okay, I have cleaned it up a little bit, and let's go over it again. So let's see, what are we supposed to do? We're going to display the multiplication table, and this is how it's going to look. We have 10 rows and 10 columns. We are supposed to use a count controlled loop, or count control loops, because we are having a nested structure here. So all right. The plan that we came up with this flowchart is as follows. We start the script, we set y to be 0, and we are going to continue in a loop as long as y is less than 10. And you can see I've colored them here to show how they belong, but if we come to that in a second here, but if we say that, all right, we start with y at 0, and as long as y is less than 10, what should we do? Something should happen 10 times. That is the 10 rows that we are controlling here with this loop. Alright, so if we say that it's one of these rows, maybe the first one, what should we do then? Because it's less than 10. Alright, Then we have a second loop here where we said it, all right, each time that we enter this outer loop, we create a new loop and say that x is equal to 0, because now we're going to go for each of these 10 columns here. So as long as x is less than 10, what should we do? We should display x times y. So that is the first value, the second value, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and so on one row. That is controlled by this gray inner loop. And as I said before, I've marked them with colors so we can see that this is one loop. What should we do when we have displayed one of these values here? We should increase x by 1 and then check the condition again. This is just so that we can keep track of how many values should we display on one row here. Alright, then when the loop is finished, the inner loop is finished, we go back to the blue color to say that alright, now we are printing a new line, so we go to the outer loop and print a new one. So we are now here on the second one. Increase y by 1. For the same reason as we increased x here, we increase y here, to keep track of how many rows, in this case, that we have printed. And now it's the second row, so then it will do the same thing with what we just described with the values here. It's going to print all the values on the second row. Then it's going to print a new line, so we're on the third line here in the beginning. Increase y, and it's going to do that until this loop evaluates to false. What happens when it does? That's when we've printed the last value here. Then we just end the script. So that is our plan for how we shall solve this task.